Please welcome Gyude Moore.
Testing.
Well, good.
Are we good? Testing. Oh, great. It's working. Hi, everybody. Hey. I was enthusiastic. Hello. Oh, great, great. How are you? Good. Well, it's good to be back. This is my third time in Chicago. I was just telling Damien that when my fellowship at the Center for Global Development ends, I'll probably seek employment in Chicago because I seem to like it. I have done more events at the University of Chicago than I've done at my alma mater, and it's right in DC. So it's actually good to be here. I think in a lot of ways, the American public's view and perception of China is filtered through two lenses. On the one hand, American businesses that seek access to Chinese markets or outsource some manufacture into China are slightly sympathetic in terms of their portrayal of China and the way they see it. And so if the American public hears about China from American businesses, largely it will be slightly positive. If the American public hears about China from the American government, that's a little different. The unclassified version of the U.S. National Defense Strategy in 2018, January of last year, designated China and Russia as strategic competitors. And consequently, in terms of strategic competition, then you don't expect the U.S. government to be flowery in their language about the portrayal of China. I think an event like this one, where a third party, I would like to think disinterested, but I'll leave that out there. A third party who I was just saying to Damien that I hope in whatever happens that both China and the U.S. benefit, but that is not my concern. My concern is what is in the best interest of Africa and African countries, and I thought I should provide a perspective in terms of China and the relationship between China and Africa. So I wanted to structure my thoughts under three headings. One of them is the first one is what I call the inadequacy of Africa's previous relationships. And then the second one is the suitability of China as a partner for Africa. And third, going forward, what next? So China doesn't just show up in Africa, right? I mean, China doesn't show up in Africa in a vacuum. Here's what was happening. Throughout the 90s, if you were to ask people, anybody who remembers or who was old enough to remember what happened in Africa in the 90s, you would know that in the 90s, Africa was a place of the first things that were happening on the continent in the 90s were wars, a lot of civil wars, Black Hawk Down, the Rwandan genocide, the Liberian Civil War, the Sierra Leonean Civil War, what was called Africa's World War, when Rwanda, Zimbabwe, Uganda fought in the Democratic Republic of Congo with different rebels there. And so with all of these wars happening across the continent, then they precipitated humanitarian disasters. You have huge numbers of internally displaced people, and you have had refugees. I too was a refugee during the war. I finished high school in a refugee camp in Côte d'Ivoire. So this was one of the things that was happening in Africa in the 90s, a lot of wars. And those wars were in part funneled, driven by what had happened with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Light weapons became easily available, and enterprising people sold arms to rebel groups across the continent, and so you had wars. And with the wars, like I said, you have significant humanitarian crisis, but that wasn't the only thing. There was a huge disease burden. HIV/AIDS, if you remember, throughout the 90s and the early aughts, was ravaging the continent. Central and Southern Africa were being wiped out. You had entire villages where there were two generations with a missing generation. You had the grandparents and the children, and the entire generation of parents were wiped out. So you had that. You had malaria. You had all of the tropical diseases you can think about. Those were happening. So it was not just the wars that were ravaging the continent. It was also the disease burden. Then something came back to bite us. a lot of African countries had taken out significant debt in the 70s, and that debt then came due. And so we came to an instance where most African countries were spending up to 60% of government revenues on just simply servicing debt. And in some instances, it was just interest, not even the, and because for years they had not serviced the debt, they accrued punitive interest and punitive charges. And so, let's go back, you had wars, disease, debt. Within this context, very few companies, very few in the West looked at Africa as a place to do business. Most of Western policy toward Africa was actually filtered through the lens of development and aid. This was the picture of what was happening in Africa in the year 2000 when China hosted the first Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, FOCAC. And the FOCAC was held in Beijing. 40 African heads of states and governments were invited. And 2000 happened to be a very fortuitous year because that was the year that China first did its going out policy, when Chinese firms were encouraged to go out to seek access to resources, but to seek access to markets. So when everyone else, and everyone else, I mean the West, saw Africa mainly through the lens of development aid, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, there was still, the Chinese actually saw an opportunity to do business. So Chinese companies go out into Africa. Now, why? All right, at this time, something else was happening. I mean, globalization is actually taking off. And we know what happened. Well, I have an argument of what happened. I mean, you may not agree with me, but in globalization, labor lost and capital won. And so when capital won, what happened was in places where capital was cheap but labor was high, like here, capital then began to invest in places where labor was cheap. Initially, it wasn't directly in China. Anyone who remembers what happened in the 90s, it was the maquiladoras in Mexico along the border with the US-Mexico border when these huge factories were moving over there. But eventually, as trade became more widespread and travel became easier, then global value chains began to develop, and China was in the middle of global value chains. China became like the factory of the world. And what do you need in a factory? You need resources to be able to convert that to finished products. Where did you have resources? Africa had the largest endowment of natural resources, so it made sense that China would go to Africa seeking resources. So that's one. It was just driven by what was happening in terms of the global economy. But secondly, China has always been suspicious of its presence and how it would be accepted by the rest of the world. And so China didn't simply want access to resources. China could always get access to resources on the international market. You could buy or you could buy whatever you wanted on the international market, but China wanted access at source. Right? And the Chinese suspicion was vindicated, right, with the trade war and everything. So China didn't want to have to depend on other people for material, for resources that it considered crucial to its economy. And so it wanted access to this at source. So Chinese companies went into Africa and negotiated deals with African governments for access to iron ore, gold, diamond, oil, whatever you can think about. They developed that. And for the first time, something changed. It wasn't simply that, but China offered a completely different model than the one that we had seen before. So you can, and listen, everything I'm saying here today, obviously you're free to check it out later. But recently there was a report where 101 companies either listed on the London Stock Exchange or domiciled in the UK, own the rights to $1 trillion of resources in Africa. So the resources are in the ground in Africa, but ownership to these resources, right, access to these resources is for companies that are listed on the London Stock Exchange. And that's how it was done. A Western company or Chevron shows up in an African country, signs an agreement with an African government, and the way it works is we pay you in terms of royalty and taxes, and then the government was responsible to take the resources and develop its country, pay for services, pay for infrastructure. China offered a different model. resource for oil, for infrastructure deals. So basically the Chinese offer was, against payment on resources you should have, you can take out a loan and build the infrastructure you need. And up to today, Africa still lags the rest of the world on every measure of infrastructure coverage, especially with paved roads and electricity. I'll give you an example, and I always like to use this because it tells you how stark it is, that only 43% of the roads in Africa are paved, and 30% of all the paved roads in Africa are in one country, South Africa. That is the scale of the infrastructure gap on the continent. And because especially Africa south of the Sahara, doesn't have the resources, doesn't have the infrastructure on which to be able to build a modern economy. Last year, 2017, Africa's total share of global trade was equal to South Korea, which is around 2.93%. This is a continent of about 1 billion people. And so when the Chinese show up and for the first time begin to build infrastructure that was not geared on the colonial infrastructure that most African countries inherited. The colonial infrastructure was basically the center and the periphery, and it was intended to take resources from the periphery and take it to the center. Now, in a world where regional value chains and global value chains are becoming prevalent, that's not possible in Africa because the infrastructure was not meant to connect African country to African country. It was meant to connect African country to the hosts, to the colonial, whatever. What China is doing now in terms of the infrastructure that they're building is connecting African cities, African capitals, making it possible for global value chains, regional value chains to develop. So it wasn't as if China showed up in Africa in a vacuum. It was that the relationship that most African countries had, there were things missing from it. It was a bit inadequate. So after the colonial experience, of course, then we had Western companies that were coming into African countries and then negotiating. It wasn't now states, it was Western companies. And, I don't know how to say this, but the deals weren't always fair. I'll give you an example. I actually printed it out. The guy in Tanzania, I'm not a big fan, but he's onto something. The Magufuli showed up and accused Barrick Gold. So Acacia Mining, which is a division of Barrick Gold, he accused them of not paying taxes. And eventually he decided to cancel their concession agreement. He said they owed them owed Tanzania billions of dollars. But this is what they, and the reason he raised this was in 2015, between 2010 and 2015, they paid only 8% in taxes and royalties to the government. But between those years, they paid 444 million in dividends to their shareholder while not paying any corporate income tax in Tanzania. And so when he came on, the CEO of Acacia Mining admits that the original mining agreement was not equitable. These were the kinds of agreement a lot of African countries entered into with Western firms. And so even though the resources were being mined in the country, very little was actually being paid in the country in terms of taxes to be able to finance this. And so it was the inadequacy of these relationships that made it easy for a partner like China to show up and for most African countries to just welcome the Chinese the way they did. So that was one. The second thing was just the suitability of China as a partner. One of the things that is not spoken about in terms of China in Africa is how, with the arrival of the Chinese, even contracts, civil works contracts, building roads, building power plants that are put out in terms of open tender are now increasingly won by the Chinese. And it's not because they're providing low quality works, it's just because the cost of a Chinese company doing the project is significantly lower than the cost of a European company doing the project. And I was saying to him, I was Minister of Public Works, and one of the projects we did was financed by the African Development Bank. The total cost of the project was around $70 million. That's what we knew it was a road project. And we had one European firm, French company, that bid, and we had about 17 Chinese companies. right? Obviously, just a law of averages, you know the winner is going to be Chinese. But the European company's bid price for a $70 million contract was $86 million. So on the day the bid was opened, you knew the European company was not going to win. But this is, and the Chinese company came in at 68.7 million in terms of being able to do that. And why? I mean, there are accusations that sometimes it's because the Chinese companies bribe African policymakers, and that is true. There are instances in which a lot of Chinese companies would win bid projects by bribing. But sometimes it's just basic project. The European company is going to mobilize with Mercedes trucks, with Scania, Volvo. Those trucks are really, really expensive to do the work. The Chinese company is going to mobilize with Howo, Sinotruck, right? That sometimes one Mercedes truck is as expensive as 2.5 Howo trucks, right? And so that's one. Most times when a European company mobilizes, the European company mobilizes with insurance for Europeans working there. Of course, you need insurance. They need R&R. The Chinese company, I'm not sure what the insurance structure is like for the Chinese companies, right? And so over and over, what we're seeing in civil works is that Chinese investment in terms of Chinese companies tend to be more price competitive without reducing the quality of what is produced. And I like to tell a story in terms of the relationship also between African governments and the Chinese government. When I was in 2008, I was very close to a friend of mine was a part of the preparation for a delegation from Kenya to visit the U.S. And the Kenyan Speaker of Parliament requested a meeting with then Speaker Nancy Pelosi. That was before this. I had water. Anyway. And when the Kenyan delegation requested a meeting with Speaker Pelosi, they were told, I don't know if it's Speaker Pelosi herself who told them, but they were told by staff that Speaker Pelosi meets with heads of state, not speakers from Kenya. So there's that. I returned to Liberia, and in 2010, I was an aide in the president's office, just like a regular aide, guy who takes notes. And I accompanied the foreign minister of Liberia to China on a visit. It wasn't even like a state visit, it was an official visit. And we went to China, and so up to today, I don't know what the Beijing airport looks like, just because we didn't use we didn't come in like regular people. Like, we were taken off the plane from when the plane landed, and we didn't see anything until we were in our hotel room, because it's an official delegation. There is something about how the Chinese would treat African delegations, regardless of how small the country is, in terms of how weak the country is in terms of its power, that such a treatment most African countries would not get in any European capital. But more importantly, me and the foreign minister of a small country like Liberia, by then we were like around 3.8, 3.9 million people, our foreign minister met with Xi Jinping. By then, he was vice president of China, and the only reason we didn't meet with Hu Jintao was because John Kerry was visiting China, and he was meeting with Hu Jintao at the same time. This was the quality of representation in terms of how the Chinese treated a small African government. If you are an African policymaker and you stand back and think about it, what about this relationship make you not embrace what the Chinese have to offer? So it was also the suitability of China as a partner, because Africa had a huge infrastructure need. China had great capacity in providing that need. Most African countries have been cut off from international financial markets. China provided the financing to be able to do this. And for the average African citizen, for the first time in a long time, they could see the direct connection between resources leaving your country and some sort of benefit, whether it was power, an airport, or a road available to you. Now, having said all this, it sounds like the relationship between Africa and China is perfect, yeah? I think it'd be wrong if I didn't point out that there are significant problems with the relationship between China and Africa. One of them is debt. So you remember the story I told about the debt? So around 2000, the Western powers most of the the industrialized countries, Western countries, met, and they through the World Bank created a program called HIPC, the Highly Indebted Poor Countries. So countries, about 33 of these countries were in Africa, and they had to go through a regimen to have their debts waived. Liberia was a beneficiary of this. $5 billion of our debt was waived. And a significant number of African countries, because what happened was African countries were spending so much money just servicing the debt, there was no money left to invest in schools, in hospitals, and the continent continuing to get poor. So one of the problems that so most African countries are close to graduation or have graduated from HIPC. And then in a 6-year period, some of them were back with $3 billion, $1.5 billion in debt. And a big chunk of that debt, not a majority of it, but a big chunk of that debt came from China. So China's role in the rising debt crisis in Africa is an issue, because eventually that money has to be paid back. And if most of the money to pay back that debt is going away from schools, is going away from hospitals, then we're going to find ourselves back in the same place we found ourselves before. But it's important to understand that of the total debt stock in Africa, China's share of that debt stock is around 17%. Most of Africa's debt is owed to multilateral development banks, but it's also owed to private. So a lot of African countries are now going to the financial markets themselves and issuing bonds, Euro bonds. And so that is the main driver of debt in Africa. I should also say that we have 54 countries on the continent, but at least 7 or 8 countries account for close to 90% of all of China's debt to the continent. Kenya, Ethiopia, Djibouti, Angola, South Sudan, Democratic Republic of Congo. That's 6, right? And maybe another one that I'm missing. Those countries alone account for more than 80% of Chinese debt on the continent. So it's important to be able to keep this in perspective. So the first thing is China's role in the rising debt crisis in Africa. The second thing is China's role in the decimation of large mammals on the continent because of the ivory and rhino horn trade in China. That by 2015, if China had not introduced the ban, most of those animals would have vanished. But it's not just those. I was saying also pangolins for their scales. There are these myths of supposedly supernatural powers that these things have, or with ivory is the prestige that comes with having ivory. So in 2015, at least the Chinese government introduced a ban, and on introduction of the ban, the price of ivory dropped 75%. So there's that. There's also the sale of Chinese arms in Africa. So take, for example, Zimbabwe. I mean, anything you hear about Zimbabwe is bad, right? Most things. But Zimbabwe still uses at least 5% of its GDP on the military. Most of Zimbabwe military financing, most of Zimbabwe military purchases are from China. The Chinese variant of the AK-47 has been linked to most of the small crises happening on the continent because, again, China does non-interference. So China doesn't depend. A country's human rights record is not taken into account when China sells arms to that country. So there's that. There is also the very real argument that the availability of cheap Chinese products makes it difficult for domestic industry to arise because they have to compete with this. And so this is also one of the problems that we have to engage in terms of our relationship with China. But I would say this. In the year 2000, there were less than 1,000 Africans studying in China. Today, China as a destination for Africans studying outside the continent is only exceeded by France. And the only reason France exceeds Africa is because of France's long colonial history. In the next 10 years, China will exceed France. My deputy minister for administration studied in China. In my last year as minister, 8 of my employees at the Ministry of Public Works were sent to China for graduate degrees. On the other side, last year, there was a conference at USC, a conference on Africa, that had to be canceled because every single African invitee was denied a visa. So if you're an African policymaker, these are the facts. It's not sentimental. It's not tied to any. You're thinking to yourself in terms of what is best for our people, what is best for my country. Which of these partners are we supposed to work with? EU policy toward Africa, EU foreign policy toward Africa now is shaped by immigration. How can we prevent more Africans from immigrating to the EU? That's what shapes EU foreign policy. When Ambassador John Bolton announced the U.S. new policy for Africa, he spent more time talking about China. You would have thought that he was actually talking, it was actually U.S.-China policy. It seems as if U.S. response in Africa was not driven by Africans' needs, but by a need to respond to what China was doing in Africa. And so this is what I think, and this is Gyude Moore, as a former minister, as a researcher on the China-Africa space, and someone who tries to influence current African policymakers. It is my view that China's presence in Africa has been and continues to be a net positive. Now, will I be able to say the same thing 10 years from now? I don't know. But for now, that is my assessment. Thank you.
How do you think the development and stability in Africa future, and how do you see the China's role in this?
So suspend disbelief, yeah? Just dream with me for a minute. The Belt and Road Initiative establishes the old Silk Road, and then there's a maritime, well, that's the belt, and then there's a maritime road. If it works, we're looking at a future in which it would take a week for goods from China to arrive at African ports. A week, at least in East Africa. Imagine that. Currently, it takes anywhere between 6 to 9 months for that to happen. Imagine that happening within a week. When I was minister, one of the projects that we worked on was this project from, if you know anything about the continent, imagine from Dakar. Yeah? Well, I don't know. But from Dakar, you come down to Guinea-Bissau, the Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, Guinea-Conakry, Liberia, Abidjan, Ghana, Togo, Benin, Nigeria. So this is a highway. It's supposed to be a 6-lane highway that takes you from Dakar and ends in Lagos. But there's also a road that's supposed to cross the continent from Lagos to Mombasa, right? So I want you to imagine a future in which it now takes a week for goods produced as far away as China to arrive at an African port in East Africa. And within 3 days or so, that is in West Africa. That is the possibility of what could happen in terms of and the role. So what I see, I think is also important to understand the kind of future that Africa faces. There is supposed to be a net increase of 800 million Africans entering the workforce by 2050. The World Bank projects that only a quarter of them will be able to find jobs. Where are these people going to work? What are they going to eat? If we do not grow our economy, in a way that is able to absorb them, that's going to be a huge problem. So whatever African countries do, whatever Africa does in terms of its economic future, is going to have very heavy Chinese prints on them. China is going to be a very big part of Africa's future for the foreseeable future. And the thing is, how can we make that relationship foreseeable, equitable? How can we make that relationship? You know, China says win-win. You know, the Chinese like to say that, win-win. China wins a lot more, right? I mean, but at least you don't lose. You know, and I think, how can we make it less likely that the African country loses in this win-win situation? So yeah.
Political social development in a country that China is really active.
You in graduate school?
No.
Oh, okay. So when I was growing up, the picture of poverty, the picture of extreme poverty, was of Ethiopia. Right, it was a famine in Ethiopia, and there was this picture growing up as kids. We saw it. It was like is a white man's hand, and he's wearing a watch, and he's holding what was said to be like an Ethiopian child or who, but he can fit the entire person in his hand. He's holding them, and that picture of Ethiopia, you know, and then growing up, you'd be like, oh, why are you wasting food? You know, there's people in Ethiopia, you know, who need the food and stuff like that. But Ethiopia is, if there's any country in Africa that's closest to the actualization of the East Asian model, it's Ethiopia today, where Ethiopia had, and because of that, Ethiopia has been growing at a pace that's higher than most African countries. When that Grand Dam is finished, Ethiopia's entire power problem would be over and be able to sell power to its neighbors. Now, that doesn't mean that all of Ethiopia's problems have gone away. But because of the significance and in terms of the size of Chinese investment, whether it's in agriculture, whether it's in housing, whether it's in an industrial zone that Ethiopia is now actually manufacturing. Some of the stuff that shows up on the shelves here and in the West is manufactured at special economic zones in Ethiopia. And so we've seen the benefits of that. And because China had invested so much in Ethiopia, but Ethiopia, as you know, is landlocked and didn't have access to the port, then China built the rail from Ethiopia to Djibouti so that you can be able to have access to be able to leave. So we've seen some of that. However, between the year 2000 and 2016, on average, African economies grew by about 4.7% a year. Significant increase in capital, but that has not necessarily turned out in terms of quality of life of Africans, improve that investment. And largely because most of the investment that goes into Africa is extractivist. You're investing in taking out oil or taking out minerals, and it's mainly taking out natural resources and returning with finished products. And the way global economy works is your participation in the value chain is where you get value. And because we're not adding value to anything, it hasn't actually worked. So that model definitely has to change. Sri Lanka. Every time I talk about this, Sri Lanka comes up, right? I mean, it's like, this is what I say in return. Between 2000 and this year, China has actually waived, restructured, or rescheduled debt 87 times. Hambantota was the first time we had seen a debt equity swap with China. So, if I were to weigh the evidence, 87 times, one. If I'm an African policymaker, what direction do you think I lean in? I'll go with the 87 times. She had a question. The lady here had a question.
Yeah. Here, and then I'm going to go back there.
Thank you for your excellent talk.
Thank you.
My question is, how do you envision technology playing on the African continent now and the future, especially for growing their economies?
2018 saw the largest deployment of robots in the United States. It's getting so cheap, it's getting so easy that even small and medium-sized companies are able to deploy them. And that has an impact. Because like I told you from the beginning, capital went to where labor was cheap. But if you can get robots to be able to do it, we're beginning to see that some of the manufacturing that left the United States, that left Europe, returning because you can get robots to do that now. What it means is that there was always the hope that when the United States became industrialized, manufacturing moved to places like China. And then after labor becomes expensive in China, it moved to like Laos and Vietnam and Cambodia, and then eventually it will move to Africa. The fear now is that by the time it reaches Africa, that manufacturing, mass manufacturing using labor will not exist. But 60% of what is left of the world's arable lands are in Africa. What can we do with that land, right? So there are now apps that are better able to do nutrient maps of the soil, so that if you are going to plant, you don't just plant potatoes in a place where it wouldn't grow. So that's a possibility of how technology can be useful. And everywhere else in the world, we've seen the benefits of the Green Revolution, of using science in agriculture. In most of Africa, 50% of that agriculture is still rain-fed. There are no inputs. And so if we can start to use technology, if we can start to use science behind our agriculture, I believe that is the path out of poverty for most African countries, agriculture. So I think combining tech with agriculture provides the best possible outlet in terms of
So I wanted to ask a question about Ethiopia, going back to Ethiopia. So Ethiopia is one of the most heavily censored for the internet in the world, and they're so tight with China. I was wondering, does the economic investment that happens from China and Ethiopia ever affect the way the government, controls its citizens' access to the internet?
Yeah, it used to be, and then Abe came in. He's amazing, right? So I couldn't exhaustively talk about all the problems in terms of the relationship, but it wasn't just Ethiopia. Now in Uganda and in Zambia, there have been instances where the state will basically turn off the internet. The ability to do that has come from China in terms of getting the state the capacity to be able to do that, so that when there's a big social movement or something like that, the state actually steps in to be able to control that. So, however, in the long term, do I see that having an impact? I don't think so, and here's why. And again, got to remember, all of this stuff is my own opinion. Most African countries, regardless of how small, are a combination of multiple ethnicities. Every government you see in power in Africa means that there's a coalition of different regions and different ethnic groups combining to be able to do it. Because of that, and we're not like China, where 90% of the population is Han Chinese, right? For us, a small country like Liberia, we're still 15 different ethnic groups. So because of that, no one ethnic group is big enough to be able to dominate the country or to be able to win the election. So for us, the most viable path to transitioning in terms of power has to be through some form of voting. And because of that, it makes it very difficult for that to become the norm on the continent. I may just be naive. In terms of the U.S. model of, I didn't talk about aid. I mainly talked about investment and and lending. So, for example, the U.S. government in its structure doesn't have a mechanism for the U.S. government to lend directly to another government, right? The U.S. government agencies can lend directly to businesses in those governments, but the U.S. just doesn't do that anymore. So China, on the other hand, doesn't necessarily lend to businesses. China is mainly G to G, government to government, in terms of being able to do that. But there are very wonderful things about U.S. aid policy, and one of them is the Millennium Challenge Corporation, MCC. MCC is an excellent way, and in terms of the size of the MCC engagement, is almost as big as anything that the Chinese have done, and for the U.S. is all grant. The first MCC compact went to Tanzania, it was almost $800 million. So MCC grants are really big, and what MCC does is that a country has to qualify for 5 years on 10 of 20 development indicators. And those indicators are not dictated by the US government. They are things from, freedom of speech, from how you're ranked by Freedom House. It's about fiscal policy in terms of how the IMF ranks you. It's about access to justice. So those are the indicators. And if a country does, and one of them is the control of corruption. If a country does good on them for 5 years, the country then gets to negotiate a compact with the U.S. We did one in Liberia. It was for $256 million to build a hydro a power plant in Liberia. So there are significantly important things about U.S. aid. I was just more focused on investment than I was on aid. Oh, and then inequality is rising everywhere. Where inequality is rising everywhere here in this country. Again, like I said, in the end, capital won, labor lost. Capital is way more mobile than labor. But I think in places that were already unequal, the inequality is even more stark. Southern Africa, especially South Africa, is one of the most unequal countries. It's actually the most unequal country in the world, and Southern Africa is one of the most unequal regions in the world. But part of that is historical, right? Because of apartheid, most of the resources were in the hands of whites and not in the hands of blacks and stuff like that. And so, yeah. And I think corruption remains a very big issue, right? I mean, there are a lot of African countries in the Panama Papers. All of that money could have been used to improve the lives of people living on the continent, but most of that money has been taken out and being used for people are using that money privately. But on the question of corruption, and then again, you have to take this with a grain of salt, right? Because I used to be a minister. But in negotiating our compact with the U.S., that something has to be done first. It's called a constraints analysis, and the constraints analysis is basically a growth diagnostic, and it attempts to answer the question of what is the binding constraint to economic growth within the country. It's very, very rigorous. It was developed by Danny Roderick and some other professor at Harvard. Anyways, so the U.S. pays for this. It's not done by Liberians. It's done by, we hire someone else to be able to do it. And at the end of it, for Liberia, what was the answer? Like, what is the binding constraint to economic growth in this little country? Was it corruption? Because corruption is a big problem. Was it the incompetence of the government, that the inability of we didn't have the capacity to be able to do it? Was it bureaucratic red tape? Was it lack of access to financing? Like, you know, all of these issues were interrogated. And do you know what it was? You can guess. I mean, it was lack of affordable and reliable electricity and lack of functioning roads. That's it. It didn't say that all of those things were not a problem. It didn't say that corruption was not a problem. It was. But the binding constraint to economic growth in the country was infrastructure. It was power and roads. Now, if your development policy in a country is about putting money into ending corruption, when the growth diagnostic says that it's building infrastructure that will lift the country out, like, that's nonsense, isn't it? I mean, this is the question. Corruption is an issue, and we should definitely tackle corruption wherever it occurs, right? But if we do a diagnostic of the country and it tells us that these are the areas in which, if you tackle this problem, the economics in the country would improve, to continue to spend money in areas that because it looks good or because you can write a report and that's what comes out, doesn't seem to me to make sense.
One final question.
Yes, one final question.
Thank you. What you just said is most interesting, but I have read that in areas where, in Africa, where China has built factories or roads or other construction, that local people are denied employment, which doesn't make people happy, as we've heard.
Right.
Do you think this is true, and can governments do anything about this if they want to?
Yeah, so this comes up. So Hambantota comes out. There's the, you know, Chinese pushing wheelbarrows come out. You know, they bring everybody from cook to. Any research has shown that that is not accurate. The research has shown that in instances where you actually see a lot more Chinese workers is because there's like a time limit on the project. The project has to be completed within a certain time. For example, if you have an African government that's going into an election and the president wants to be able to show, hey, I built this, look at this, you know, and then they give the Chinese company an impossible schedule, they're going to bring in people to be able to do that. But I'll give you an example of something I personally experienced. I just got an email the other day from an expat worker who's working in Liberia, and she was traveling in the southeast and sent an email and said, hey, The road that has been built here is basically been built by Liberians with 1 or 2 Chinese supervisors. That has been my experience. More than 86% of the workers on all of the projects that we had done, even projects that were won by the Chinese, was done by Liberians. In a lot of instances, in terms of the supervisory roles, you have way more Chinese than you have nationals in those roles. But I don't think, maybe it was an issue in the early aughts, in the late 90s when the Chinese first arrived in Africa. But by and large, that problem has actually gone away. I think Africa faces a very difficult future. I talked about the rise in the population. Nigeria is supposed to exceed the US in terms of the size of its population. Niger is expected to see its population triple. 26 of the 28 countries who expect to see the population double are in Africa. So there's that. I talked about how 53% of our people depend on farming, and most of that farming is rain-fed. So climate change is going to affect us. The 10 countries that are in the Sahel are already suffering from it, and then it's become militarized. Because of what happened in Libya, now most of that jihadist stuff is spreading across the Sahel. So we have that, right? And then Africa needs to create, the continent needs to create at least 18 million jobs every year from now to 2035. We're not anywhere close to that. So what happens? The future of this continent. So Africa needs partners. Africa is not in a position where it can choose between the US and China or choose between Europe and China. Africa, there's enough on the continent that fits everybody, that everybody can be a part of. And every time that the US has actually withdrawn, nature abhors a vacuum. Somebody, something is going to fill that vacuum. So it is my hope, one of the things that I've tried to do is to try to present what I believe is a clear-eyed view of what the experience has been on the continent in terms of China's presence there. I highlighted the benefits that have accrued to African societies and African economies because of the Chinese presence, but I've also highlighted some of the problems that have emerged because of China's presence on the continent. How we're able to minimize the latter and increase the former is the challenge that African policymakers face. Thank you.